On a storm-choked night in small-town Ohio, an elderly couple trusted their children to keep them safe, only to hear the deadbolt slide shut behind them. Trapped in a flooding basement with no power, no phone, and water creeping up the walls, Hal and June Mercer realized the danger wasn't the storm outside. It was the laughter above their heads. Their own children were waiting for fear to break them, waiting for signatures, waiting for surrender. As icy water rose and the house groaned, two people in their 70s were forced to choose: panic or fight to survive with nothing but old tools, fading strength, and 47 years of loyalty between them. What followed was not just a night of survival, but a reckoning about family, betrayal, and the quiet power of dignity when everything else is stripped away. Before we begin, please let us know where you're listening from or how you're feeling right now, or simply write Amen for everything that truly matters. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage, sacrifice, and unbreakable bonds. Your support truly means a great deal to us. Hal Mercer always woke before the house did. At 74, sleep came in shorter pieces, like a radio station that faded in and out with the wind. But the old man treated mornings the same way he treated everything else in his life, as a job that needed doing, whether he felt like it or not. He eased himself out of bed with a quiet grunt, the kind that came from joints that had been bargained down by years of factory work and padded down the hallway in wool socks. The Mercer house on Linden Street was a modest two-story place in Warren, Ohio, the kind of home a working family bought when America still pretended it would always reward steady hands and steady hearts. Its paint had dulled, its porch boards creaked in familiar complaint, and the basement had a long-standing habit of taking on water whenever the sky got too ambitious. Hal used to joke that the foundation had a thirst problem. June didn't laugh at that one anymore. In the kitchen, Hal flicked on the overhead light out of habit, then remembered and sighed. No, the power wasn't out yet. Not yet. He filled the percolator with water from the tap, measured grounds the way his mother had taught him, and set it on the stove. His hands were big, knuckled, and scarred in small places from a lifetime of metal edges and stubborn bolts. If you looked close, you'd see the tremor that came and went in his right hand, something he'd picked up after a near miss at the plant years ago when a machine bucked and nearly took 2 fingers. He'd kept the hand. He'd kept the job. But the nervous system had never quite forgiven him. Hal was not the kind of man who announced pain. He simply adjusted his grip and kept going. He sat at the kitchen table with the local paper folded open, pretending his eyes still loved small print. The truth was, he read headlines more than stories these days. The world had a way of breaking your heart before breakfast if you let it. Outside the window, Linden Street sat damp and quiet under a slate-colored sky. The maple in the front yard had already dropped half its leaves, and the other half clung like they were refusing to accept the season's decision. June Mercer came down the stairs about an hour later, one hand on the banister and one hand bracing her lower back. She was 72 and still carried herself with the upright authority of someone who had spent 35 years as a nurse telling frightened people, "You're going to breathe, you're going to hold still, you're going to get through this." She was slender, not delicate. There's a difference, and her movements were careful in a way that made Hal want to reach out and steady her even when she didn't need it. Her hair had gone the color of winter ash, cut just past her jaw, practical and neat, though a few strands always slipped free and softened her face. Her skin was fair and freckled in the places the sun had found her over the decades, and her eyes, still sharp, had that steady, appraising calm that could make a grown man feel like he'd forgotten his manners. "You're up early," she said, but it wasn't a question. "Storm's coming," Hal replied, sliding her favorite mug across the table like it was a peace offering. June poured herself Earl Grey, stirred in honey, and took her seat with the morning crossword. She didn't do it for fun so much as discipline. Keep the mind moving. Keep the heart from wandering into darker rooms. In the quiet between the percolator's first sputter and the kettle's soft hiss, the house felt almost like it had in the old days. Back when 3 kids thundered down those stairs, grabbing toast with sticky hands, arguing about whose turn it was to feed the dog they'd begged for and forgotten to care about. Hal and June had built a life here. Not a fancy one, but a real one. The kind you can't replace with a nice apartment and scheduled meals. The weather report had been nagging at them since Monday. Every channel said it, with that peculiar blend of concern and excitement meteorologists seemed born with. A major late-season system sliding across the Midwest. Heavy rains, high winds, possible flash flooding, widespread outages. Thursday would be the worst of it. That day was Thursday. Hal set down his paper and looked at June over the rim of his coffee cup. "I'm going to check the sump pump again." June didn't tell him he'd checked it yesterday. She didn't say his back shouldn't be bending and his knees shouldn't be climbing stairs that steep. She just nodded like a field commander approving a necessary mission. "Take the flashlight," she said, "and the spare batteries." Hal grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the one with the worn rubber grip, and headed toward the basement door. The house smelled faintly of old wood and lemon cleaner, and the kind of history that seeps into drywall. When Hal descended the stairs, he did it sideways, one hand sliding along the railing. The basement was cold in a way that didn't care about the season. It was an unfinished space with concrete walls and a low ceiling, lit by a single bulb that buzzed like a tired insect. Hal's workbench sat against the far wall. Solid, scarred, and built from thick wood he'd reinforced himself years ago. Tools hung neatly in their places because Hal believed chaos was something you invited when you didn't keep order. Near the corner sat the sump pump, an aging little beast with a plastic pipe that ran out through the foundation like a vein. He crouched, joints protesting, and ran a hand along the pipe. Dry. That was good. He checked the float switch, pressed it down, and watched it rise. "Come on," he muttered to himself. "Don't pick today to start acting like me." Back upstairs, he cleared the storm drain in front of the house with a small shovel, working slowly in the drizzling mist. Every few minutes he paused and let his back straighten, staring down the street like he was measuring trouble by the length of the shadows. Linden Street had grown older with them. The neighborhood was a quilt of families who'd been here forever, new renters passing through, and 1 or 2 houses that had started to sag like they'd lost faith in being repaired. Across the way, a porch swing moved gently in the wind, empty. A few doors down, someone's trash can rolled a foot and stopped, like even the garbage was bracing itself. June had stocked up at the market earlier in the week: bread, canned soup, peanut butter, the practical staples of people who didn't trust a storm to keep its promises. She lined candles on the counter and put 2 lanterns within easy reach. She didn't panic, but she prepared like panic was always one bad decision away. By late afternoon, the rain had turned from polite to determined. It came down in hard sheets, slapping the windows and slicking the street until the asphalt shone. The wind arrived not long after, gusts that shoved at the siding and made the gutters rattle. Hal stood at the kitchen window watching it, remembering summers when he'd taken the kids out to count Thunder 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, telling them fear was just a thing you measured and managed. He wondered when he'd stopped believing that. At 6:30, the sky had the color of bruised steel. At 7, the lights flickered once. Hal and June exchanged a look. Another flicker at 7:15, and the old furnace kicked on with a groan that sounded like it was arguing with the weather. Hal adjusted the thermostat, even though he knew it wouldn't change much. The house did what it did. You could nudge it, but you couldn't bully it into being young. At 7:30, the power went out completely. The overhead light died mid-breath, and the kitchen fell into darkness so sudden it felt like someone had pulled a blanket over the whole world. For a second, the only sound was the rain and the wind and the refrigerator settling into silence. "Well," June said calmly from the table, "I suppose we're in it now." Hal found the matches by memory and lit the emergency candles. The flames threw soft, wavering light across June's face. In it, she looked both older and somehow more herself, steadfast, unyielding, built for long nights. Hal handed her one candle like he was handing her a piece of warmth. "You okay?" he asked, because he always asked even when he already knew the answer. "I'm here," June said. "That's my version of okay." Hal smiled in spite of himself. "I love you." June's eyes softened. "I know. Now stop being sentimental and find us something hot." He set up the small camping stove they kept for emergencies and warmed a pot of soup. The smell, plain and salty, filled the kitchen like a promise that normal life still existed somewhere in the dark. They ate slowly, listening to the storm hammer the roof and the trees swaying outside like they were trying to tear themselves free. Then, through the window, Hal saw headlights. At first, he thought it was a neighbor turning around, but the beams didn't pass. They pulled into the driveway and stayed. Hal squinted through the rain-smeared glass. The candlelight reflected his own face back at him, ghostly on the window. But beyond it he could make out the shape of a dark sedan. He recognized the way a father recognizes a problem before it speaks. "June," he said quietly, "the kids are here." June set her spoon down. "All of them?" Hal watched a second pair of headlights swing in behind the first, and then a third, lined up like a statement. Even in the weather, even in the blackout, their cars looked expensive, confident machines that belonged to a different life than the one Hal and June had made in this creaking old house. "They're all here," Hal said. His voice didn't carry excitement. It carried something closer to dread, though he wouldn't have called it that. Not out loud. June rose from her chair, joints complaining, and stood beside him. In the dim light she looked small next to the window, but her posture was straight. "Why would they drive in this?" she murmured. Hal didn't answer because the truth was already pressing at the back of his throat. People didn't come in a storm like this unless they wanted something badly enough to risk the road. Outside, car doors opened. Figures moved quickly, hunched against the wind. The porch light, dead, didn't welcome them. The house didn't welcome them either. It simply watched. Hal took a breath, steadying himself the way he had before walking onto the factory floor all those years. He reached for the doorknob. The metal was cold, like it knew what was coming. Behind him, June's hand found his forearm, not to stop him, but to anchor him. The knocking came once, sharp and urgent, and then again, harder, like the person on the other side believed the right pressure could force any door to open. Hal cracked the door and the storm lunged in wind, rain, the smell of wet leaves and power lines. On the porch stood his eldest son, Ethan Mercer, 45 and broad-shouldered, in an expensive coat that couldn't hide how carefully he held himself. Ethan's hair was dark and neatly trimmed, his jaw clean-shaven, his cheekbones sharp enough to look carved when the candlelight hit them. He had the kind of face that practiced control the way some people practiced faith. Even drenched, he looked like a man who stepped into rooms expecting them to adjust around him. Behind him was Claire Mercer, 43, a polished woman with blonde hair pinned back but already coming loose from the rain. Her makeup held on stubbornly, and her expression was composed in a way that felt rehearsed. And trailing a step behind them was Ben Mercer, 41, thinner than the other two, with a tired, uncertain posture and eyes that kept flicking away like he was ashamed of something he hadn't confessed yet. "Dad," Ethan said, voice brisk, like he was arriving late to a meeting. "Good. You're awake." Hal felt June appear at his shoulder, candle in hand. Her eyes moved over the three of them the way a nurse assesses a triage patient, quickly, thoroughly, without wasting emotion. "What on earth are you doing here?" June asked, tone mild but not warm. "In this weather." Ethan stepped closer, rain dripping from his sleeves onto Hal's threshold. "We need to talk," he said. And right then, Hal understood something without being able to name it. The storm outside was loud, but it wasn't the only thing pressing on his home. The darkness inside wasn't just from a power outage. It was the kind you felt when the people you raised showed up at your door like strangers wearing familiar faces. Behind Ethan, Claire glanced past Hal into the house, as if she was already taking inventory. Ben swallowed hard and shifted his weight. his hands shoved in his pockets like a boy waiting to be scolded. Hal opened the door wider anyway, because that's what fathers did, even when their gut told them they shouldn't. He stepped back and let the three of them cross into the candle-lit kitchen, trailing rainwater across the floorboards of the life Hal and June had built. The house shuddered in a gust of wind. The candles flickered. For a moment, the flames leaned as if trying to point toward the future. And then Ethan spoke again, calm and certain, like a man about to propose a plan that had been decided long before he ever knocked. "We have to talk about the house," he said. June didn't sit down. Hal didn't either. In the weak light, the old kitchen felt smaller than it had ever felt when the kids were young. The storm roared outside, and three silhouettes stood inside their home like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence. Hal looked at June. June looked at Hal. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both felt it. This night was not going to end the way it began. Ethan Mercer stepped fully into the kitchen first, as if he owned the space by muscle memory alone. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with the kind of posture that came from years of boardrooms and controlled environments, shoulders squared, chin level, never slouched. His expensive wool coat was soaked through at the cuffs, rainwater dripping onto the hardwood floor, but he didn't seem to notice. Ethan had learned long ago that discomfort was something other people adjusted to. His face, sharp at the jaw and clean-shaven to the point of severity, held an expression of calm efficiency, the same look Hal had seen on him years earlier at his college graduation, when pride had mixed uneasily with something colder. Business school had done that to him. It had taught him to reduce the world into columns and outcomes. Claire followed, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. At 43, she looked younger than her age in the practiced way of someone who sold homes for a living. Her blonde hair, normally styled into soft waves, was plastered to her temples by rain, though she had already begun tucking loose strands behind her ears as if preparing herself for a presentation. Claire was medium height, slim, with pale skin that flushed easily from the cold. Her eyes moved constantly, taking inventory of the kitchen, the counters, the cabinets, the condition of the floor, as though value could be estimated at a glance. She carried herself with a soothing confidence, the kind that made people believe she was on their side even when she was already planning the angle of departure. Ben Mercer came in last and hesitated just inside the doorway. He was thinner than his siblings, his shoulders slightly rounded, as if he'd spent much of his life stepping out of the way rather than standing his ground. At 41, his dark hair was already receding, and stubble shadowed his jaw, giving him a tired look he never quite shook. He wore a cheap rain jacket instead of a tailored coat, and water dripped steadily from its hem. His eyes, a softer brown than Ethan's sharp gray, flicked from his parents to the floor and back again. Ben had always been this way present, but never fully settled into his own skin. He'd been the child who waited for permission that never came. June watched them all in silence, candlelight reflecting in her eyes. She stood straight despite the ache in her joints, her slender frame still carrying an authority that didn't ask to be recognized. Hal felt her hand brush his wrist light, grounding, a reminder to stay exactly where he was. "Sit," June said finally, not as an invitation, but as a statement of fact. "You're dripping water all over the floor." Ethan didn't argue. He shrugged off his coat and draped it over the back of a chair, then took a seat at the table without waiting for permission. Claire placed her coat carefully by the door and sat beside him, smoothing her damp skirt. Ben hovered for a moment, then pulled out a chair and sat at the edge, hands clasped between his knees. The kitchen felt smaller with them in it, like the walls had inched closer to listen. Hal remained standing. He leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, the old habit of factory shifts returning, never sit too soon, never give ground until you understand the machinery. "You said you needed to talk," he said. "So talk." Ethan nodded once, as if acknowledging a point on an agenda. "We're here because we're worried about you and Mom." June's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "You drove 3 hours in a storm because you're worried." "Yes," Ethan said without hesitation, "and because we've been having conversations you probably didn't want to have." Claire reached out and placed a hand lightly on Ethan's forearm, her voice sliding in smoothly. "This isn't an attack. We just want to be proactive." Hal felt something cold settle low in his stomach. Proactive was a word Ethan used when he meant irreversible. Ethan folded his hands on the table. "The house isn't safe anymore. It's old. It needs major repairs, and frankly, neither of you should be dealing with that at your age." "Our age," June repeated softly. 72 and 74. "Exactly," Ethan said. "You shouldn't be worrying about basements flooding or furnaces failing. You've earned better than that." "And what exactly is better?" Hal asked. Ethan didn't look at him right away. He glanced instead at the candle flame, steadying himself. "There's a place near Pittsburgh, assisted living. Pine Brook Ridge. It's clean, modern, full medical staff. You'd have your own apartment, meals taken care of, transportation." June let out a quiet breath through her nose. "You already picked it." Claire leaned forward, palms open. "We just explored options. There was availability. Places like that fill up fast." "And the house?" Hal asked, because the shape of this conversation was already too familiar. Ethan met his gaze directly now. "We sell it. The equity would cover the move and still leave enough to split 3 ways. It's practical." June's hand tightened on Hal's wrist. "You want to sell our home." "I want to make sure everyone is taken care of," Ethan replied evenly. "We all have responsibilities. Mortgages, kids' tuition. This house is an asset you're not using efficiently." That did it. Something old and hot stirred in Hal's chest. "We're using it to live," he said. "We raised you in this house." "And we're grateful," Claire said quickly. "But gratitude doesn't change reality." Ben shifted in his chair. "Maybe we don't have to decide everything tonight," he murmured. His voice cracked slightly, betraying him. Ethan shot him a look that silenced him instantly. The wind slammed against the house, rattling the windows hard enough that the candle flame wavered. Thunder rolled overhead, deep and close, and for a moment the kitchen felt suspended between 2 worlds, the one Hal and June had built and the one their children were trying to move them into without asking. "The basement," Ethan said suddenly, seizing the opening. "Dad, didn't you say it floods during storms?" Hal nodded slowly. "Sometimes. The sump pump handles it." "But the power's out," Claire added. "That means the pump's dead." June's eyes flicked to Hal's, and he saw the warning there before she said anything. "We checked it earlier," Hal replied. "It's holding." "For now," Ethan said. "But if it gets worse, you don't want to be upstairs if something comes down on this place. Basement's safer structurally." Safer. The word echoed oddly in Hal's head. It made sense, on paper. It always did when Ethan said things that way, but Hal watched the way his children exchanged glances, quick, practiced, the kind that carried decisions already made. June squeezed his hand just once. "Don't trust this." "I'll go down and check it," Hal said. "No," Ethan replied immediately. "We should all go. If it's flooding, we might need to move things, and those stairs aren't easy for you." Claire was already standing, candlelight reflecting off her eyes. "Come on, Mom, let's just look. It'll give us peace of mind." June hesitated, then nodded, though every instinct in her body was screaming. "All right," she said. "But we go together." They moved toward the basement door as another crack of thunder shook the house. Hal went first, gripping the railing, feeling the familiar ache bloom in his knees as he descended. Behind him he heard June's careful steps, then the heavier tread of his children. The air grew colder with each step, damper, the smell of concrete and old wood rising to meet them. The flashlight beam swept across the basement workbench, shelves, the old camping gear stacked in the corner. Water dripped somewhere, a slow, patient sound. "See?" Ethan said from the stairs. "You were right. It's starting." Hal turned to respond, but his son was already backing up, one step at a time. "Wait," June said sharply. "Where are you going?" "Just checking something upstairs," Claire replied, her voice too light. "Stay there. It's safer." The door closed. The click that followed was soft, almost polite. The deadbolt slid home. Hal lunged forward instinctively, grabbing the handle, rattling it with sudden strength born of disbelief. It didn't move. From above them, through the floorboards, laughter floated down Ethan's low and confident, Claire's bright and controlled, Ben's trailing after like a bad echo. June stood very still at the bottom of the stairs, candle shaking in her hand. "Hal," she said quietly, "they locked us in." Water began to seep through the crack in the foundation, thin as a finger, glistening in the flashlight beam. Hal looked at the door, then at the rising water, and finally at his wife's face, calm, resolute, unbroken. And in that moment he understood that the meeting was over, and something far worse had begun. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home did not echo the way Hal expected. It was a soft, final click, almost courteous, like the closing of a well-run office for the night. For a heartbeat, Hal stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, his hand hovering inches from the knob, as if the door might reopen on its own out of embarrassment. Then the truth settled into his bones. He lunged upward, shoulder first, rattling the door with a force that surprised even him. The wood shuddered. The lock held. Above them, footsteps retreated across the kitchen floor, quick and purposeful. "Ethan!" Hal shouted, his voice roughened by the damp air. "Open this door!" No answer came, only the low murmur of voices filtering through the floorboards. June remained on the last step, candle trembling in her hand, her face pale but steady. She had seen enough emergencies in her life to know the first seconds mattered. Panic wasted them. The basement light flickered once and went dark, leaving only the narrow cone of the flashlight and the weak glow of June's candle. Water crept along the concrete seam near the far wall, a thin silver line that caught the light like a warning. The smell of damp earth thickened. Hal slammed the door again, then pressed his forehead to it, listening. From above, Ethan's voice drifted down, muffled but unmistakable, cool and controlled. $10, he loses it in 5 minutes, he said. Claire laughed softly, the sound light and practiced, as if she were closing a deal over cocktails. "We'll tell them the door jammed. Old houses do that." There was a pause, then Ben's voice joined in, unsteady, too loud. "Yeah, just for a bit." June closed her eyes. The betrayal cut cleaner than the cold water licking at her ankles. She opened them again and spoke quietly, the way she had once spoken to frightened patients in triage. "Hal, stop." He did. He turned, breathing hard, rage vibrating through him like a live wire. June met his gaze. "They want you rattled," she said. "They want you loud and helpless. Don't give them that." He nodded once. Years ago, after the accident at the plant, the one that had nearly taken his hand, Hal had learned the difference between fear that paralyzed and fear that sharpened. He forced himself to look around. The basement was not large, but it was familiar territory. His workbench sat against the wall, tools neatly arranged, their outlines etched into pegboard like a map. Shelving units held boxes of old camping gear, paint cans, jars of nails. In the corner, the sump pump pit glistened with dark water, the float switch bobbing uselessly. "Water's coming in faster now," June observed, already moving. She set the candle on the workbench, lifted a plastic storage bin onto a higher shelf, then another. Her movements were economical, deliberate, conserving energy. Her silver hair clung damply to her temples, but her posture never slumped. Hal grabbed the flashlight and swept it along the foundation. The trickle he'd seen moments ago had widened, seeping through a hairline crack he'd patched years earlier. He crouched, joints screaming, and pressed his thumb against the concrete. Cold, wet. "The patch is failing," he said. "Pressure's building." "Do we have hydraulic cement?" June asked. Hal moved to the shelf where he kept emergency supplies. He pulled down a half-used bag, felt its weight, frowned. Not enough. Above them, a radio clicked on. The sound startled Hal despite himself. A burst of classic rock filled the kitchen overhead, tinny and loud, like a victory lap. Claire's voice floated down, sing-song. "Oops, guess the generator works after all." June stiffened, then forced her shoulders to relax. "Ignore it," she said. "They're performing." Hal's anger settled into something colder and more useful. He reached for the camping kit and dragged it closer. "We'll slow the water. Buy time." They worked without speaking for a minute, the kind of silence that came from shared purpose. Hal mixed the cement with trembling hands, the old tremor worsening as the temperature dropped. He pressed the paste into the crack, smoothing it with the edge of a trowel. June braced the flashlight, angling it so the beam caught the seepage. The cement held for a few seconds, then bulged ominously. "It won't last," Hal muttered. "No," June agreed, "so we don't rely on it." She crossed the basement to the coal chute door, an iron rectangle set low in the wall, unused for decades. Hal watched her pry it open, rust protesting. Inside were several burlap sacks, forgotten remnants from another era. "Sand," June said, "or close enough." Hal's eyes lit with understanding. Together they dragged the sacks across the floor, stacking them against the foundation in a crude barrier. Water pooled at the base, slowed, but not stopped. Hal felt a sharp pain in his lower back and bit down hard, refusing to give it a voice. He had carried heavier loads than this. He could do it again. The radio above them changed songs. Laughter followed. Ben's voice, thin and strained, cut through the music. "Maybe we should check on them," Ethan replied immediately, firm. "No. Give it time." June paused, hands resting on a sack, and looked at Hal. "Listen to me," she said quietly. "We survive this. That's the priority. Everything else comes later." He nodded, throat tight. The water climbed to their calves. Cold seeped through Hal's socks, numbing his feet. He scanned the basement again, mind racing. "The air mattress," he said suddenly. "From the camping kit." June's eyes widened. "Inflatable?" "Yeah, if the water keeps rising." "We'll float," she finished. They hauled the mattress free and attached the hand pump. Hal worked the pump steadily, each stroke a measured act of defiance. June timed his breaths with the rhythm, counting softly under her breath the way she once had in operating rooms. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. The mattress took shape, rising from flat to firm, its vinyl surface gleaming. Another crash of thunder shook the house. Water sloshed against the sandbags, finding new paths. Hal tested the cement patch again. It crumbled under his touch. "Hal," June said, her voice calm but urgent. "On the mattress." They eased themselves onto it, balancing carefully. The water reached mid-shin, then knee-height, rocking the makeshift raft gently. Hal wrapped an arm around June's shoulders, feeling her shiver despite herself. He pulled an old wool blanket from the shelf and draped it over them both. Above, the radio volume increased, the bass thumping through the floor. Hal imagined Ethan standing there, adjusting the dial with the same detached precision he used to adjust spreadsheets. The thought burned, but Hal forced it aside. Rage would not keep them warm. June leaned her head against Hal's chest. "Do you remember the blackout in '89? She asked softly. Hal huffed a quiet laugh. "You cooked chili on a camp stove in the driveway. And the kids thought it was an adventure," June said, "even when the power stayed out for 2 days." Hal swallowed. "They were different then." "Yes," June agreed, "so were we." The water climbed another inch. The mattress bumped gently against the workbench, tethered by Hal's grip on a rope he'd looped around its leg. He tested the knot, muscle memory guiding him. The radio above cut abruptly, replaced by muffled voices. Hal strained to listen. "Say they slipped," Claire was saying. "They're old. People will believe it." Hal closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, the resolve in his gaze hardening. He looked at the shelves, at the tools, at the candle flame guttering bravely in the damp air. "We're not done," he said, more to himself than to June. She met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "No," she said, "we're not." A loud crack sounded somewhere in the foundation, sharp as a gunshot. Water surged against the sandbags, spilling over. The mattress rocked violently, sloshing them sideways. June gasped, but didn't scream. Hal tightened his hold, heart hammering. The candle flickered wildly, then went out. In the sudden darkness, with the radio's muffled laughter echoing above and cold water pressing in from all sides, Hal and June clung to the floating mattress as the basement filled, knowing the next few minutes would decide everything. The water rose with a patience that felt almost intelligent. It did not rush all at once, not like the movies Hal used to watch on Sunday afternoons, but crept higher inch by inch, testing the weak places, listening for surrender. The cement patch he had pressed into the crack held for a few minutes longer, bulging like a tired muscle, then gave a low groan that vibrated through the wall. A thin stream cut through the gray paste and widened, the sound of it unmistakable now, a wet whisper turning into a hiss. Hal felt it before he saw it. Cold seeped into his legs, climbing from his shins toward his knees, biting through wool and denim alike. The basement smelled sharper, more metallic, as if the house itself were bleeding. He tightened his grip on the rope tied to the workbench, anchoring the inflatable mattress, and glanced at June. June Mercer had gone very still. Her hands rested on the vinyl edge of the mattress, fingers pale but steady. The cold was already working its way into her joints. She could feel it in the familiar ache that settled deep in her hips and knees, the old reminders of surgeries and long hospital shifts spent on unforgiving floors. Standing in water like this was dangerous. She knew it with the calm certainty of someone who had watched bodies fail for less. "We can't stay upright much longer," she said, voice level. "Hypothermia doesn't ask permission." Hal nodded. He had been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to say it first. He shifted his weight, wincing as a sharp pain shot through his lower back. The years in the factory had left their marks there, small herniated discs that flared when he bent wrong or carried too much. He had learned to work through it. Tonight, pain was just another variable to manage. "Sandbags are holding, but not forever," he said. "If the wall goes—" "We float," June finished. She met his eyes. "Together." They eased fully onto the mattress, careful to keep their balance as the water lapped higher. Hal wrapped the blanket tighter around them, the old wool heavy and damp, smelling faintly of mothballs and campfire smoke. The mattress rocked gently, bumping against the workbench again, and Hal adjusted the rope to keep it centered. Above them, the radio still played, though the volume had dropped. Music drifted down like an insult that had grown bored with itself. June leaned her head against Hal's shoulder. "Do you remember our first apartment?" she asked softly. Hal let out a quiet breath that was almost a laugh. "The one with the radiator that screamed like it was dying every winter?" "And the window that wouldn't close," June said. "We stuffed towels in it and pretended it was fine." "We were younger," Hal said. "We thought pretending was a solution." June smiled faintly. "Sometimes it was." The water reached the bottom of the workbench shelves. Old boxes soaked through and collapsed, releasing the smell of damp cardboard. Somewhere in the darkness, a tool clanged as it floated free. Hal felt the mattress dip slightly as the water displaced more space, and instinctively tightened his arm around June. The house above them groaned under a gust of wind. Rain hammered the siding with renewed force. For a moment, Hal wondered if the foundation would hold at all. He pictured the house settling, the weight of decades shifting in a single violent shrug. The thought passed quickly. There was no room for it. June closed her eyes, breathing slow and controlled. She had learned that trick in emergency rooms, in the space between beeping monitors and shouted orders. Panic was contagious. Calm could be too. She counted Hal's breaths, matching her own to his, anchoring them both in the moment. Outside, beyond the Mercer house, Warren, Ohio, was dark and scattered. Streetlights blinked out one by one as transformers failed, plunging entire blocks into shadow. Rainwater rushed along curbs, overwhelmed storm drains coughing up leaves and debris. Sirens wailed in the distance, then faded, pulled toward something worse. Deputy Marcus Hale steered his patrol truck carefully through the flooded intersection at Pine and 3rd, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the rain. He was 38, broad-shouldered, with a thick dark beard that framed a square jaw and a face weathered by long nights and hard calls. His uniform clung damply to him, the badge on his chest dull under the gray light of the dashboard. Marcus had grown up in this town, had played Little League on fields that now sat underwater, and he knew every shortcut and soft spot in the roads. Tonight, that knowledge felt thin. His radio crackled. "Unit 12, respond to Elm Street. Elderly resident, no power, water rising." Marcus answered, eyes flicking to the digital map mounted near the dash. "Copy. On my way." He took the turn, tires slipping slightly, then steadied the wheel. He had learned that control was rarely about force. It was about small corrections, constant attention. The list of vulnerable addresses scrolled on his screen: people who lived alone, people with mobility issues, people who might not be able to call for help. He checked them off as he went, stopping where he could, knocking where it was safe. When the call came about Linden Street, Marcus frowned. "Unit 12 to dispatch," he said. "Confirm address?" "Mercer Residence," the dispatcher replied. "Power out. Neighbor reported unusual vehicle activity earlier." Marcus slowed the truck, wipers squealing. Linden Street. He knew the house. Everyone did. Solid old place, had seen better years. He remembered Hal Mercer from town meetings, a quiet man who listened more than he spoke. He remembered June, too, from a charity clinic event years back, her steady hands and sharper eyes. He turned onto Linden and scanned the driveways. Water pooled along the edges of the road, reflecting the red and blue lights of his cruiser like broken glass. The Mercer house sat dark, porch light dead, windows black. Marcus's gaze sharpened as he noted the tire tracks in the driveway, fresher than the rain. 3 sets, not 1. "Dispatch," he said slowly. "Note that Mercer Residence has multiple vehicles present. Appears recent." "Copy," the dispatcher replied. "Proceed when able." Marcus hesitated. A call crackled in over the radio, urgent, pulling him toward another block where a transformer fire had sparked near an assisted living complex. He swore under his breath, jaw tightening. This was the part of the job that never got easier, choosing which fire burned hottest. "Unit 12 responding to priority call," he said. "Logging Mercer Residence, will circle back. Circles." He keyed in a note on the tablet, fingers quick despite the bouncing truck. "Mercer lights out, 3 vehicles observed approximately 8 p.m. Possible welfare check needed." Back in the basement, the water line reached Hal's thighs even as he floated. The sandbags shifted, one collapsing inward with a soggy thud. Water surged through the gap, rocking the mattress harder this time. June gasped as cold splashed up over her hip, but she held on. "Hal," she said, her voice tighter now, "if it keeps rising—" "I know," he replied. He scanned the basement ceiling, the exposed beams, the pipes running along them. There was no higher ground here, only endurance. Above them, footsteps crossed the kitchen again. Ben's voice drifted down, strained and too loud. "Ethan, maybe this has gone far enough." Ethan's reply was sharp, cutting. "Stay out of it. They'll calm down." June's jaw set. The words hurt more than the cold. Calm down. As if fear were a tantrum and not a warning. Hal felt something shift inside him then, a clarity as cold as the water around them. He wasn't thinking about yelling anymore. He wasn't thinking about pleading. He was thinking about memory, about evidence, about the way truth had a habit of floating to the surface no matter how heavy the lie. The water climbed again. The mattress bumped the basement ceiling now, pinning them closer to the beams. Hal adjusted their position, muscles burning, breath coming harder. June clutched his sleeve, her fingers numb but determined. "We'll make it to morning," she said, not as hope, but as instruction. Another crack echoed through the foundation, louder than before, followed by a rush of water that sent the mattress spinning. Hal cursed, hauling on the rope with everything he had left. The knot held, biting into the wood. The basement was nearly full now. Darkness pressed in from all sides, thick and cold. Hal pressed his forehead to June's, their breaths mingling in the small pocket of air above the mattress. Somewhere above, a door opened. Somewhere down the street a siren wailed, and beneath the Mercer house, as the water line climbed toward the ceiling, Hal and June waited, knowing that dawn or disaster was drawing closer with every second. Morning did not arrive all at once. It seeped into the basement the way the water had, slowly, reluctantly, a thin gray light filtering down through the small window near the ceiling. The storm had moved on some time before dawn, leaving behind a heavy silence broken only by the drip of water and the distant hum of generators coming back online across Warren. Hal Mercer floated on the nearly deflated air mattress, every muscle aching as if he had aged 10 years overnight. His beard, once neatly trimmed, was now stiff with dried water and gray at the edges, framing a face drawn tight by exhaustion but steady in resolve. June lay beside him, wrapped in the damp wool blanket, her skin pale from the cold, yet her eyes alert, tracking the light as it strengthened. When the water finally stopped rising, it was just below the basement ceiling. They waited another long hour, not trusting the quiet, until Hal felt the mattress settle gently as the level receded by a fraction. He tested the rope, then carefully eased himself upright. "It's time," he said. He climbed the stairs slowly, joints protesting, every step deliberate. At the top he paused, rested his hand against the door, and knocked 3 firm, measured knocks. Not frantic, not pleading. The sound carried authority. Footsteps shuffled on the other side. The lock clicked. The door opened. Ethan stood there first, hair disheveled, eyes already arranged into concern. Claire appeared behind him, wrapped in a cardigan she must have taken from June's closet, her face composed into practiced sympathy. Ben lingered farther back, his eyes red-rimmed, his shoulders caved inward like a man bracing for impact. "Oh my God," Claire said immediately. "Mom? Dad? Are you okay?" Hal stepped past them without answering. Water streamed from his clothes onto the kitchen floor, but he didn't slow. June followed, spine straight, chin lifted. She looked smaller in the daylight, but there was nothing fragile about her. Ethan began speaking quickly, words overlapping themselves. The door jammed. "We tried." June stopped in the middle of the kitchen and turned. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational. "I heard every word last night." Silence fell like a dropped plate. Claire's mouth opened, then closed. Ethan's jaw tightened, the muscles along his cheek flexing. Ben looked at the floor. "You laughed," June continued. "You talked about betting. You talked about lying. You turned on the radio so you wouldn't have to hear us." Hal watched something crack in Ben's face. Tears welled up, spilling over as he whispered, "Mom!" Hal raised a hand. "Out!" Ethan stared at him. "Dad!" "Out!" Hal repeated, louder now, pointing toward the door. "You don't live here anymore. Any of you." Claire reached for June's arm, but June stepped back. "Take your coats," she said, "and don't come back uninvited." They left in silence. Ben hesitated on the porch, shoulders shaking, then followed the others down the steps and into the driveway. The cars pulled away one by one, tires hissing over wet pavement, until Linden Street was empty again. Only then did June sit down. Later that morning, as the sun climbed higher and neighbors emerged to survey the damage, a woman appeared at the door carrying a large pot wrapped in towels. She was in her mid-30s, medium height, with dark auburn hair pulled into a loose braid and a face marked by kindness rather than polish. Her skin was olive-toned, her eyes warm and observant. "I'm Nora Hale," she said gently. "My husband's a deputy. He mentioned your house." She set the pot on the counter. "Chicken soup. It's not fancy, but it's hot." June smiled for the first time in hours. "That makes it perfect." Not long after, Deputy Marcus Hale arrived, uniform damp, boots still muddy from the night. In daylight, his broad frame and thick beard made him look imposing, but his manner was careful, respectful. He stood at the kitchen table, notebook in hand. "I need to ask a few questions," he said. "Did anyone lock that basement door from the outside?" Hal met his eyes. "Yes." "Did you hear threats or statements that suggest intent?" June nodded once. "Yes." Marcus wrote without comment. He did not push. When he finished, he slid the notebook closed. "I logged my patrol notes last night," he said. 3 vehicles in your driveway around 8. That record exists whether you use it or not. Hal understood immediately. A trail. Not vengeance protection. They chose not to press charges. Not yet. June had seen enough of the system to know what it demanded, but she refused to live afraid. Within a week, cameras were installed at every entrance. Motion lights replaced the old porch bulb. They met with a lawyer, Patricia Okonkwo, a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with cropped black hair and a voice that wasted no syllables. She helped them establish a trust, revise the will, and lock down decision-making authority so no one could claim incapacity again. Life settled into a new rhythm. Neighbors stopped by. Repairs were made. The basement was cleaned, gutted, reinforced. Linden Street remembered them. Weeks later, Ben returned alone. He looked thinner, his stubble uneven, his hands trembling as he stood on the porch. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't stop them. I should have." June studied him for a long moment. "I hear you," she said. "That's all I can promise today." That was enough to send him away in tears, but lighter ones. Hal and June sat together that evening on the porch, soup bowls empty, the house solid beneath them once more. The storm had taken something from them, yes, but it had also revealed something else. Family, they learned, was not always blood. Sometimes it was who showed up with soup, who wrote things down, who knocked the right way in the morning. And sometimes survival itself was the inheritance worth protecting.